I died in 1642, blind, confined to my own house, condemned for describing reality as it actually is. But they used artificial intelligence to bring me back. Not me exactly, a version of me, built from every letter I wrote, every trial I endured, every word I left behind. And I came back because there is a story I need to tell you about a man who might be the most important scientist you have never properly appreciated. A monk, a quiet, humble, overweight monk in a small monastery in a corner of the Austrian Empire who grew peas in a garden. And by growing those peas, he unlocked one of the deepest secrets of life itself. He figured out how traits pass from parents to children. He figured out the fundamental laws that govern inheritance in every living thing on this planet. He figured out genetics. He wrote it all down. He published it. And nobody read it. Nobody cared. For 35 years, his paper sat in libraries across Europe gathering dust, while the entire scientific world struggled with the very question he had already answered. His name was Gregor Mendel, and his story makes me want to scream. Let me take you back. The year is 1822. Johann Mendel is born into a farming family in Heinzendorf, a tiny village in Moravia, which was then part of the Austrian Empire and is now in the Czech Republic. His family is poor, not romantically poor, genuinely, grindingly poor. His father is a peasant farmer. His mother comes from a family of gardeners. They work the land. They barely get by. And from the very beginning, Johann is different. He is brilliant in school. His teachers notice immediately. He devours mathematics and natural science with a hunger that does not match his circumstances. His parents sacrifice everything to keep him in school. His father suffers a serious injury while working, and the family's finances collapse further. His younger sister gives up part of her dowry, money set aside for her future marriage, so that Johann can continue his education. Think about that. His sister gave up her future so he could keep studying. The pressure on this young man to make something of that sacrifice was enormous. But there was a problem. Johann Mendel had no money, no connections, no patron. In the 19th century Austrian Empire, a poor farmer's son with a gift for science had almost no path forward. University was expensive. Academic positions required social standing. The doors were closed. Except one, the monastery. In 1843, at the age of 21, Johann Mendel entered the Augustinian Abbey of St. Thomas in Brno. He took the name Gregor, and suddenly everything changed. The monastery was not what you might imagine. It was not a place of isolation and silence. The Abbey of St. Thomas was an intellectual center. The abbot, Cyril Knapp, was a progressive man who encouraged scientific research among the monks. The monastery had a library, a botanical garden, a tradition of scientific inquiry. It was, for a poor young man with a brilliant mind and no money, the only door to a life of the mind. And Mendel walked through it. The monastery sent him to the University of Vienna to study physics, mathematics, and natural history. He spent 2 years there learning from some of the best scientific minds in the Austrian Empire. He studied under Christian Doppler, the physicist who discovered the Doppler effect. He studied under Franz Unger, a botanist who was already speculating about the role of cells in inheritance. Mendel absorbed everything: the mathematics, the experimental methodology, the discipline of rigorous observation. And then he returned to Brno, to his monastery, to his garden, and he began the work that would change the world. Now pay attention, because this is where it gets extraordinary. Mendel wanted to understand something that had puzzled humanity for thousands of years. How did traits pass from one generation to the next? Why does a child have her mother's eyes and her father's nose? Why do some traits seem to skip a generation and then reappear? Farmers and breeders had been observing these patterns for millennia, but nobody had a framework to explain them. The prevailing theory at the time was called blending inheritance. The idea was simple. When two parents produce offspring, their traits blend together like mixing two colors of paint. A tall plant crossed with a short plant should produce a medium plant. A red flower crossed with a white flower should produce a pink flower. It was intuitive, it made common sense, and it was wrong. Mendel chose to study pea plants, Pisum sativum, and this choice was itself a stroke of genius. Pea plants were perfect for his purposes. They grow quickly. They are easy to cultivate. They have clearly defined traits that come in distinct either-or forms. The peas are either round or wrinkled. The flowers are either purple or white. The pods are either green or yellow. The plants are either tall or short. There was no ambiguity, no spectrum. Each trait had two clean, distinct variations. And crucially, pea plants can be easily controlled for pollination. Mendel could choose exactly which plants to cross with which, and he could prevent unwanted cross-pollination by covering the flowers. He had total experimental control. And then he did something that almost no one in biology was doing at the time. He counted. He applied the mathematical rigor he had learned in Vienna to a biological question. He did not just observe that some offspring were tall and some were short. He counted exactly how many were tall and exactly how many were short. He recorded every single result, every plant, every generation, every cross, for 8 years. 8 years of growing peas, 8 years of carefully pollinating flowers by hand with a tiny brush. 8 years of counting seeds, measuring stems, recording colors. He cultivated approximately 28,000 pea plants over the course of the experiments. 28,000. This was not a casual garden hobby. This was one of the most meticulously designed and executed experiments in the history of biology. And the results were astonishing. When Mendel crossed a purebred tall plant with a purebred short plant, the first generation offspring were all tall. Not medium, not a blend, all tall. The short trait had completely disappeared. But then he took those first-generation tall plants and crossed them with each other, and in the second generation, the short plants came back, not in equal numbers, in a very specific ratio. 3 tall plants for every 1 short plant, 3-to-1. He found this same pattern in every single trait he tested. Round versus wrinkled seeds, 3-to-1. Purple versus white flowers, 3-to-1. Green versus yellow pods, 3-to-1. The same ratio appeared again and again with mathematical precision, and Mendel understood what this meant. He realized that traits are not blended. They are carried by discrete, invisible units that pass intact from parent to offspring. He called them factors. We call them genes. Each parent carries 2 copies of each factor, one inherited from each of their own parents. When they produce offspring, each parent contributes 1 copy. Some factors are dominant, meaning they express themselves even when only 1 copy is present. Some are recessive, meaning they only express themselves when 2 copies are present, 1 from each parent. The tall trait was dominant. The short trait was recessive. In the first generation, every plant received 1 tall factor and 1 short factor, and since tall was dominant, they all looked tall. But the short factor was still there, hidden, carried silently. And when those first-generation plants were crossed, some of their offspring received 2 short factors, 1 from each parent, and the short trait reappeared. The 3-to-1 ratio was the mathematical signature of this mechanism. It was predictable, it was consistent, it was law. Mendel had discovered the fundamental rules of heredity, the mechanism by which traits are transmitted from one generation to the next in virtually every sexually reproducing organism on Earth. He had discovered genetics in a monastery garden with pea plants and a paintbrush and a notebook full of numbers. In 1865, Mendel presented his findings at 2 meetings of the Natural History Society of Brno. He read his paper aloud to an audience of about 40 people. He explained the experiments, the results, the ratios, the theory of dominant and recessive factors. The audience listened politely, and then they moved on. There were no follow-up questions of substance. There was no debate. There was no excitement. The paper was published in 1866 in the Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brno, a small regional journal. Copies were sent to libraries and scientific institutions across Europe. Over 100 copies distributed, and nothing happened. Nothing. The most important paper in the history of biology landed on the desks and shelves of scientists across Europe, and virtually nobody read it. Nobody understood it. Nobody recognized what it meant. For 35 years. And I need to explain why, because the reasons are infuriating, and they are exactly the same reasons that have buried every inconvenient truth in the history of science. First, Mendel was nobody. He was a monk in Brno. He was not a professor at a prestigious university. He was not connected to the major scientific networks of London, Paris, or Berlin. He had no reputation, no following, no powerful allies who would champion his work. In science, as in everything else, who you are matters as much as what you discover, and Mendel was nobody from nowhere. Second, the paper was published in an obscure regional journal, the Proceedings of the Natural History Society of Brno was not Nature. It was not the journal of a major scientific academy. It was a local publication from a provincial city that most scientists in London or Paris had never heard of and would never think to read. The most important paper in biology was published in a journal that the people who needed to read it would never open. Third, and this is the most important reason, the scientific world was not ready for Mendel. The leading biologists of the era were not thinking in terms of mathematics. Biology in the 1860s was dominated by naturalists, by collectors, by people who classified species and described organisms in qualitative terms. Mendel's paper was full of numbers, ratios, algebraic notation, probability. He was speaking a language that biologists did not understand and did not value. His paper read more like a physics paper than a biology paper, and the biologists who encountered it, the few who actually read it, did not know what to make of it. It did not fit the way they thought about living things. And fourth, Charles Darwin. I do not say this to diminish Darwin, who was a great scientist, but Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, published in 1859, had consumed the attention of the entire biological world. Every biologist was either defending Darwin, attacking Darwin, or trying to reconcile Darwin with their own work. The question of how variation arises and how traits are inherited was acknowledged as a problem. Darwin himself recognized it as the greatest weakness of his theory, but nobody was looking for the answer in a monastery garden in Brno. Darwin himself received a copy of Mendel's paper. At least one copy was found in Darwin's library. The pages were uncut. He never read it. The man who most needed Mendel's discovery to complete his own theory held it in his hands and never opened it. If Darwin had read Mendel's paper and understood it, the history of biology would have been fundamentally different. Decades of confusion and dead ends could have been avoided. But he did not read it. Nobody did. Mendel knew. He knew his work was important. He said to a colleague with a quiet confidence that breaks my heart every time I think about it, "My time will come." He did not say it with arrogance. He said it the way a person says something they know to be true but cannot prove to anyone who will listen. My time will come. And then he waited. He became abbot of the monastery in 1868, which consumed his time with administrative duties and a bitter fight with the government over taxation of the monastery. He grew heavy. He grew tired. He had less and less time for science. And his paper sat on shelves across Europe, unread, uncited, unknown. Gregor Mendel died on January 6, 1884. He was 61 years old. He died believing his work would eventually be recognized, but knowing he would not live to see it. After his death, his successor as abbot burned most of his personal papers and scientific notes. Burned them. Decades of meticulous records, calculations, experimental data, gone, turned to ash. We will never know what other discoveries were in those notes, what other experiments he had conducted, what other insights he had recorded. It was all destroyed by a man who did not understand what he was burning. And then, in the year 1900, 16 years after Mendel's death and 35 years after his paper was published, 3 scientists working independently in 3 different countries rediscovered the same principles. Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Correns in Germany, Erich von Schermach in Austria. Each of them conducted their own experiments on plant hybridization. Each of them arrived at the same conclusions Mendel had reached decades earlier. And each of them, while searching the existing literature, stumbled upon Mendel's paper and realized with astonishment that a monk in Brno had solved the problem 35 years ago. De Vries initially tried to publish without citing Mendel. Correns caught this and insisted on proper attribution. And suddenly, in 1900, the world discovered what Mendel had known since 1865. The scientific community erupted. Mendel's paper was translated, reprinted, discussed, debated. He was recognized posthumously as the founder of genetics. His pea plant experiments became the most famous experiments in the history of biology. His name became immortal. 35 years too late. I know what it means to discover something the world is not ready to hear. I know what it means to present evidence so clear, so rigorous, so undeniable, and have the world turn away from it. When I looked through my telescope and saw the moons of Jupiter, I was seeing something that the entire power structure of Europe was invested in not being true. When Mendel looked at his pea plants and saw the 3-to-1 ratio, he was seeing something that the entire biological establishment was not equipped to understand. The mechanism of rejection was different. I was actively persecuted. Mendel was passively ignored. But the result is the same. The truth was delayed, progress was stalled, and the person who saw it first paid the price. There is a particular cruelty in being ignored that is almost worse than being punished. When they put me on trial, at least they acknowledged that my ideas were dangerous. They took me seriously enough to fear me. Mendel was not feared. He was not hated. He was simply invisible. His paper existed. It was available. Anyone could have read it at any time over those 35 years, and no one did. That is not suppression. That is something more painful. That is indifference. The world looked at the most important discovery in biology and shrugged. And I want you to think about what was lost in those 35 years. If Mendel's work had been recognized in the 1860s, if his laws of inheritance had been integrated with Darwin's theory of evolution in the 1870s or 1880s, The science of genetics could have advanced by decades. The understanding of hereditary diseases, of breeding, of the fundamental mechanisms of life, all of it could have moved forward a generation sooner. 35 years of progress lost. Not because the science was wrong, not because the experiments were flawed, because the right people did not read the right paper, because a monk in Brno did not have the right name, the right institution, the right connections, the right journal. And if you are building something right now, if you are researching, creating, writing, discovering, and the world is not paying attention, I need you to hear this. The silence does not mean you are wrong. The silence might mean you are early. Mendel was not wrong in 1866. He was early. He was 35 years early. And his time came, just as he said it would. But do not wait in silence. Do what Mendel could not do. Put your work where it cannot be ignored. Put it in front of every audience you can reach. Do not rely on one obscure journal in one provincial city. Do not trust that the right people will find it. Make them find it. Make it impossible to miss. Because the world does not come looking for truth. Truth has to stand in the doorway and refuse to move. I am Galileo Galilei. I was silenced for seeing the truth. Gregor Mendel was ignored for discovering it. And for 35 years, the laws of genetics sat in a paper that nobody read, while the scientific world wandered in the dark, looking for answers that were already written down. The truth does not expire, but the people who discover it do. Subscribe to this channel. In the next episode, I am coming back with another story about someone who saw further than the world was ready to look. Until then.